now for the season. This webinar is being delivered as part of GRDC-funded Seasonal Status of Pests and Diseases for Growers project. My name is Maryam Estangar, PestFacts SA editor, and I'm hosting the webinar today. The Department of Primary Industries and Regions acknowledges the traditional custodians throughout South Australia and their continuing connection to the land, waters, and community. We pay our respects to all members of the Aboriginal community and their cultures, and to elders both past and present. In today's session, we have two senior research scientists sharing their expertise with us. First, we have Dr. Maarten van Helden, who will provide updates on recent pest reports in grains, aphids activity, and native budworm trends. Following that, Dr. Kym Perry will discuss Etiella Redlegged Earth Mite, the related degree day models, and practical guidance on monitoring for diamondback moth. We will have time for a Q&A session at the end, so please type your questions in the chat throughout the webinar, and we will address them after the presentations. Now I'll hand it over to Maarten to get us started. Thank you, Maarten.
Thank you, Maryam. Thanks, everyone. Welcome, everyone. A little summary of the pest risk that we've seen so far in this, once again, interesting season, but all seasons are interesting. So let's go and take a look. And as usual, rainfall is determining a lot of things in Australia. 2025 was a very dry summer with a very late break. We're now luckily catching up. We have, say, normal rain at the moment, even though there's still a bit of an uneven distribution. For those of us who are located in the east, it's still a bit dry. Luckily, the BOM forecast for the coming weeks is that we will catch up a bit more. So it actually looks quite promising in spite of this very dry summer. This growing season is giving some good hope that we'll get a reasonable yield, better than last season. So for entomologists, the dry summer usually means that there is a reduced pest risk, especially for the early pest. And that's exactly what we've seen so far. If you look at all the reports that we get in through the PestFacts channels and also some other contacts that we have, there have been very few or sometimes even no reports on pests. Snails and slugs seem to be relatively calm. Earwigs, nothing heard of. Slaters and millipedes, weevils, aphids, cutworms, it all seemed to be relatively calm. That doesn't mean that there's not going to be a problem later on, but so far it seems that all those populations have been reduced by the drought, and therefore there's very little at the start of the crop. What's going to happen now in spring is another question, so we'll have to think about that, and I will have a little bit more information later on, as Kym will have some information later on. So there are a few exceptions, and they're actually quite logical exceptions that we were expecting, except for a few. Red-legged earth mite and lucent fleas are two pests that are over summer in the egg stage, and the eggs are usually quite well protected against the drought conditions, so they seem to be not affected. And we've had some report of red-legged earth mite popping up, some lucent flea very locally in paddocks, but they have been causing some issues in some cropping areas. Very surprising this year was herringbone caterpillars, and we're still getting reports in of unusual caterpillars, so quite dark in general, with a little chevron type herringbone marking on their backs. They over summer as pupae, and that's probably also quite a good protection against the droughts that we've had. And there's also been some reports of Mandalotus weevil activity. Again, a species that over summers as a pupae, so it's a resting stage, well adapted to the warm and dry conditions, and they will just appear in autumn when the rains start. They will hatch. So we also noticed this year that we get a little bit more reports in from people that are near irrigated crops or near areas where some greenery subsisted. And when I say greenery subsisted, that can be very simple things like close to the town, where there's always gardens, there's always a bit of irrigation in the gardens, and that's where some of the pests can then survive a little bit easier. The only aphid on which we've had a bit of reporting was cowpea aphid, Aphis cracivora. which popped up in some areas, not huge numbers, but a bit unusual compared to other years. Overall, I think we can agree that the pressure of insect pests this year was quite low, which is good news. So now we're getting into spring. It is getting a bit warmer. We've had an interesting weekend with all of a sudden 28 degrees at 11 o'clock in the evening at my place, which was a bit surprising. But let's see where we will go. The crops in general are in good nick and they're growing quite well. So I think everybody's happy with that, which will also mean that they will be less sensitive to small pests. So if there's still a few red-legged earth mites or a few springtails over, that's not a problem. They will be outgrown by the crops. You can actually almost see the crops growing. If for those who are growing canola, from one day to the other, you can see 5 to 10 centimeters increase. It's just quite spectacular at the moment. Also, things like virus infestation of crops, which can occur if there's aphids in the crop, they will be much less impacting now because the crops are already well developed than in other cases. And of course, we're also expecting beneficials to build up. I have to be a bit careful there because the beneficials might also have suffered from the very dry summer conditions, so maybe they'll be coming in later than usual. Keep your eyes open because it's always nice to have some beneficials doing some good work in your crop, and that might need that you don't have to spray an insecticide. So for the insects that are already in the crop now, in the area of the crop, because they've started such low population levels, I'm not expecting huge problems building up for those insects. But we do see some increases. DBM, diamondback moth, is clearly a little bit on the rise, so very clearly an indication that we need to keep monitoring. And we've also very recently seen some cabbage aphid coming into canola crops, so they're also already on the move. Probably build up on things like wild radish and things like that, which are also flowery. And yeah, they can move into the crop, so be aware of those pests and keep your monitoring up. So there's a couple of pests that are more migratory, that are especially some of the moths, where the caterpillars can develop somewhere in Central Australia, and they can then migrate sometimes over very long distances. Typically, native armyworms, budworms, and cutworms are in that group. And they can have developed quite spectacular because in the central part of Australia, there was actually quite a high rainfall this year. So there must have been quite a bit of green. The caterpillars have developed there, the moths will appear and they will migrate. Whether they will migrate to our area is very much depending on weather systems and wind and those kind of things. So it's really difficult to actually predict that. But it can happen, and we need to be aware of that risk. So we do have this year, as in other years, a pheromone trapping network for Helicoverpa. So I'll show you a few images on the next slide. But we also have some reports coming in on common armyworm. So it is possible that these populations that have built up elsewhere are now coming into our crop, and that can be a bit unexpected if you haven't seen them before. So be very much aware of that and do your monitoring there. Just a little slide for the budworms. So these are a couple of traps that we have. Each circle is a trap. And as you can see, especially in the very western area around Ceduna and even west of Ceduna, we've had a couple of quite spectacular flights of native budworms going around. If they reach a crop, and they lay eggs, then that is potentially a risk. Of course, at this moment, the risk is that they will lay eggs, the caterpillars will develop, and you can have head lopping due to the caterpillars eating, especially in cereals. So be very much aware of this, and the only way to actually know how big your population is to do sweep netting in your crop. So agronomists and farmers get the nets out, do a bit of sweep netting and see how high the numbers are. There are thresholds for these pests that you can use in your region. But yeah, be aware the risk level might be higher than you expect. Once again, I'm not saying that you have to go and spray. Just be alert, not alarmed, do your observations, and then you can decide whether or not it is worth doing a spray. And if you don't have to do it, try not to do it because You would also kill beneficials and things like that, which we actually would like to maintain in our crop. So very quick summary. Low pest pressure this season overall so far. Some small surprises like the herringbone caterpillars, which we've never seen so much. Keep monitoring, and also for us, keep reporting, because PestFacts can only be up to date as long as you guys keep reporting. So please keep us informed about everything that you see. Thank you very much.
So spring, and we have a new suite of pests that become important to manage in spring, and Maarten's been over a few of those. So I'm going to cover Etiella, Redlegged Earth Mite, believe it or not. It's an establishment pest, but there are things that we can do in the spring to make a difference to your crops the next autumn. And diamondback moth. So let's start with Etiella. If you're growing lentils, you need to know about this insect. It's a native insect. It's a pod-boring insect, which means the grub feeds inside the pod and will consume or partially consume the seed. In lentil crops, the life cycle looks like this. So the insects overwinter in all of those other native legumes or exotic legumes that might exist in the landscape, and they develop very slowly. In the spring, they complete development and hatch out as moths, and those moths then start to fly into your lentil crops. Now, the issue here is that the moths will lay eggs on the pods or the calyx, and those eggs sit there for about 4 to 7 days, depending on temperatures. As soon as they hatch, the grub will bore directly down into the pod, and once that happens, you can't actually spray them with insecticides because they're protected. So the key with this pest is to very much target control at the adult moth stage to prevent them from laying eggs in the first place, which means that spray timing is critical. So this is what happens if you don't quite get your spray timing right, and it's a big year for Etiella. They can consume multiple seeds, and in fact, one grub will often damage more than one pod. And the annoying thing is they don't eat the whole grain. They make quite a mess, as you can see. I should mention that Etiella is a sporadic, transient pest, so populations do vary from year to year. Sometimes there's more Etiella around than in other years. So there can be 2 to 3 generations of flights into lentils in the spring, depending on where you are. But it's the first generation that we're most interested in. It's the one that typically causes most damage. And the flights typically begin around September or October, depending where you are. You can get another generation a month later. And then, of course, later in the year, close to Christmas, you might get another one. But, of course, crops and pods will be mature then, so that one's not a problem. So it's really that first lot of flights we want to know about. Now, through some very good research that was done by Sardi nearly 20 years ago, it was found that you can predict the timing of these flights using a degree-day model. So using local temperatures, daily maximum minimum temperatures, beginning from the 21st of June onwards, you can figure out how many heat units have been accumulated. And when the number of degree days reaches 351, that's predicted to be the 10% onset of the flight activity. And that's typically recommended for the timing when to start your monitoring. Now, the model's proven to be pretty good across most areas, at least of South Australia and Western Victoria that we know of. But occasionally there are earlier flights, so we now recommend starting your monitoring at more like 300 degree days. There is a tool now which makes it really easy for you, developed by Sardi, and all you need to do is go to that website and enter your coordinates, then make sure you click the update coordinates button, and you'll get predictions of the year's degree day accumulations to date. And you can see the graph on screen here. The orange line is this year. I think this location is Roseworthy. And you can compare with the last few years and see how we're tracking. So what you do is you run your model, check the number of degree days, and you're targeting 300 for your monitoring. You can also compare with the previous years as to when the model hit 300 to give you a guide. Just earlier today, I ran the model for 4 locations, and we're sitting 223 at Thurrockfield, more advanced at Kadina and Cummins, and as expected, Horsham being much colder, it takes a lot longer for the insect to develop. How to monitor? There's two ways of doing it. The first one is to use a pheromone trap, ideally at least 2, maybe 3 in a crop. And the trap has a sticky base and a sex pheromone attractant, which attracts male moths. And you sit that 25 centimetres above the crop canopy, and you're really just looking for the presence of moths in the crop to tell you that they've arrived. Sweep netting is still recommended. So you would take groups of 20 sweeps randomly in the crop. And if you see more than 1 or 2 moths, you really should be spraying. By the way, if you do need pheromone lures, please contact me. I can get those out to you. The moths are thankfully easy to identify. It's a pyralid moth or a snout moth, and it has a very distinctive white stripe running along the forewing, forward-facing beak, and a brown band across the wings when it's at rest. The other thing you'll notice is that the moth undertakes really short flights of 1 to 2 metres in the crop canopy if you disturb them. It's quite distinctive once you get your eye. So in summary, you must try to control those moths before egg laying. Once you do spray a crop, it's recommended to start monitoring again after 7 days. And as I said, that second generation could still be an issue. Do your Etiella sprays or your budworm sprays control Etiella? Well, sometimes it can help, but sometimes the flights just don't occur at the same times. And so you really should be monitoring Etiella anyway to make sure you're getting that one right. Okay, let's dive on to red-legged earth mite. There is an excellent guide available put out by GRDC that was recently updated last year, and it's really like a recipe book for how to manage these mites. Now that we're here in spring, as I mentioned earlier, we want to start thinking about the risk to crops next autumn. The guide has an excellent risk assessment tool. We're not going to go through this in detail, but that's just to show you 2 of the pages. The page on the left describes the previous spring. Now, we are currently in the previous spring in relation to next year's crops. And these are some of the things that contribute to the populations you might have next year. So I just want to highlight a couple of things. If you grew chickpeas or cereals this year, they're not good hosts. So you wouldn't expect high populations of mites next year, as long as you're pretty weed-free. The second thing is time right. If you use a time right spray at the right time, that can be very effective and reduce your risk for next year. But you would only do that in a situation where there is a high risk for next year and you do need to control them. Then the weather can also have an influence as well. So if we get a hard finish, that can curtail mite breeding, but if it's more of a softer finish, you can have more mites next year. Okay, and the other thing to highlight for next autumn is, are you planning to plant a susceptible crop like canola or a pasture? Those can be hammered by mites if you've got lots, and if that's the case, you might think about putting a time right application out. So how does time right work? Well, this is the life cycle of red-legged earth mite. It typically hatches in May, and then there are 2 generations of winter eggs that are laid. Now, the third generation starts to be produced in September. So the third generation, those eggs are actually diapause eggs. They don't hatch straight away, but they survive over the summer as a dormant phase. What time right is trying to do is to control those mites before they lay those diapause eggs. You need to make sure that you're dealing with red-legged earth mite, because time right only works for that mite. Some of the other mites don't have that same distinct breeding phase, and time right won't work. So you just keep in mind to get your ID right, and you can sometimes have mixes of different mites together. The time right tool is very easy to use, and it's been recently updated. Just go to that website, the wool.com/time right website, enter your postcode, and it will give you an optimal spray date for your location, as shown in the graph there. And mine here in Lower Mitcham is the 17th of September, so I better get my skates on if I want to do it. That grey shaded window there is also a good time to spray. So yeah, feel free to have fun with that. That time right date won't change year on year because it's based on latitude. Now, if you're going to use a spray, clearly you need to be aware of resistance, insecticide resistance, which is spreading in the red-legged earth mite. And unfortunately, we've now got populations involving resistance to synthetic pyrethroids and also organophosphates in both the Western Australia, where it was first detected, but now also in the eastern states. So that means we've got to be careful when choosing chemicals. Once again, in the guide, there is a fantastic resource for deciding what to do, depending on whether your mites are resistant to SPs or OPs. This table here is there's 3 tables, but this one has the resistance to both SPs and OPs. In all of these tables, the first recommendation is to use omethylate initially and then monitor to see how well that worked. If you have issues with control, you'll need to take some of the other steps. Okay, finally, to diamondback moth. It can be first helpful to understand what increases the risk of the diamondback moth outbreak. So, you know, diamondback moth arrives in canola every year, but we don't have outbreaks every year. It would only be every 3, 4 or 5 years, or even less frequent, depending on where you are. So the first precursor is the green bridge. So the areas that have the worst issues with DBM typically have a lot of brassica green bridge in the landscape. This is a photo of Lincolnweed, and it's a classic host plant for it. If you do get a big green bridge of brassicas, then your base population of diamondback moth becomes very large and you get early crop colonisation. The other precursor to an outbreak would be a mild winter, so warm, relatively warm and dry, because rainfall is a thing that kills DBM if it's heavy. We haven't really had a winter that is, I would describe as mild. It's been fairly normal. Thirdly, in the spring, this is when the population can really accelerate if you get the right conditions, particularly warm and a dry spring. Those insects can develop really quickly. And fourthly, natural enemies play a big role. And if you've got lots, that can help keep a lid on your population. But if there are not many, or you've nuked them all with a broad spectrum insecticide in canola very early in the spring, then you can actually end up with quite a problem with DBM, because the pest can run away without any natural enemies there. Now, if we look at the weather, Maarten covered this beautifully. It's been extremely dry over the summer, and really that knocked a head on the green bridge. So we don't have that precursor, and I would expect there to have been a very low base population. That's good news. Now, if we look at the temperature and the rainfall for winter, first of all, the temperature, these graphs are the anomalies, by the way, how the rainfall and the temperature compare to average conditions. And we see that the temperature is around about average, if not, you know, only slightly warmer in July and August in some parts of the state. The rainfall's been fairly normal. In fact, July was a little bit above average in some areas, and that will have helped to put a lid on diamondback moth. In August, it's become a little bit drier, but again, quite average, but a little bit drier than usual. So diamondback moth will now start to build up, and it sounds like Maarten and Mariam have had some reports of that. So in the spring, it's recommended to begin your monitoring. Fortnightly is a good interval to start with, but if they're building up rapidly, you'd want to switch that to weekly. Also monitor the forecast. So is it going to be warm and dry over the next few weeks? That then will increase the risk, and you can predict that they will build up more rapidly. If you need to treat, first of all, compare your sweet net numbers with thresholds based on crop stage. So if you're early to mid-flowering, which we probably are now in a lot of areas, the typical threshold is 50 or more larvae per 10 sweeps. And those thresholds increase as the crops become more mature. The 2 insecticides you'd probably choose initially at this point would be either a Firm or XRL insecticide. The XRL is one that's now fairly newly registered in canola as of the last year or so. If you do need to spray more than once, Don't use the same insecticide on consecutive generations. I think with a firm, you can do a 2-spray strategy 7 days apart. But if you need to do multiple sprays, then certainly rotate those chemicals. And just to point out that there's also a really good guide on managing diamondback moth. Thank you.
So once again, thank you all for taking the time to join us, and a special thanks to our presenters for sharing their valuable insights. Before we finish, as Maarten mentioned, just a reminder that the PestFacts SA team is always keen to hear from you. Please contact Maarten or myself to report any invertebrates you come across in your crops, whether they are pests, beneficials, or even the usual suspects. We look forward to seeing you at a future session. Wishing you all a great day. Thank you.